Good afternoon and welcome to today's IABC Heritage Region webinar, Connecting Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity to Reputation Management and Organizational Results. I'm Heather McElrath, President of the IABC DC Metro Chapter. There's a strong business case today for pursuing a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive workplace. Organizations that create this environment experience greater levels of innovation, customer satisfaction, loyalty, profitability, and employee engagement. Professional communicators can play a critical role in implementing the necessary cultural shifts and positioning their organization in the marketplace as a respected brand and employer of choice. This webinar will provide valuable insight, including global trends around the workforce of the future, today's best practices in equity, inclusion, and diversity, and planning for the future, and ways to incorporate relevant takeaways into your integrated communications strategy. Next slide. Tracy M, ABC, APR, is a communications expert and leadership coach based in Maryland. She has held senior leadership positions with global and national brands in aerospace and defense, engineering, senior housing, and banking. Her executive experience includes leading teams in customer service, finance, marketing and communications, talent acquisition and development, diversity and inclusion, and corporate social responsibility. Before launching her small business and coaching practice, Tracy led the public affairs team at the Maryland Insurance Administration. In her podcast, Brave Girls with Tracy M, she uses storytelling to empower other women. Tracy holds a BA from McDaniel College, an MBA from the University of Baltimore, and an MS in Business Technology Management from Stevenson University. You can learn more at tracym.com. Next slide. Before we begin, we have a couple of housekeeping notes. I'd like to introduce Amy Miller, an IABC Heritage Region board member and our tech associate for this webinar. Amy will review a quick few points to help you gain the most from this experience. Amy?
Thank you, Heather. Everyone, if you would like to watch today's webinar in full screen mode, then mouse to the top right portion of your screen and you'll see 4 small arrows. Click on that symbol to toggle in and out of full screen mode. During the presentation, if you'd like to send us a comment or question for discussion, please use the chat button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Just mouse down to the bottom of your screen and your toolbar will appear, including the chat button. Tracy will pause to take questions briefly during the presentation and will also answer questions at the end. If you'd like to join the conversation via chat later, right now we're showing some thoughts that may spur ideas for you. Also, today's webinar is being recorded. As a registered attendee, you will receive the following: a link to our very brief survey as you leave the webinar. Please take a moment to respond so we can keep making improvements. You'll also get an email with links to the recording of today's webinar and the slides, as well as the survey link in case you missed it on your way out of today's session. And now, back to Heather. Heather, are you muted? Are you muted?
Tracy, over to you, I believe. Sorry, I'm not unmuted.
Thank you, Heather and Amy. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on what's turning out to be a very important topic in the world. I'm just sending positive prayers and thoughts out to everyone as we deal with this global pandemic. Now more than ever, we realize how connected we all are. And so as I was preparing this material, I thought about this may give you a little bit of a reprieve from creating content around COVID-19, as well as the content that we're all consuming. What I hope to do today is to shed some light on some of the trends that are happening in the equity, inclusion, and diversity world, and some of the trends that you need to pay attention to in your role as a communications professional. So I'm going to cover the fundamentals, I'll take a break, as Amy said. Then we'll talk about some of the trends that are happening in the world today. And then we'll connect it back to our role as reputation management and employer brand stewards. And then I'll give you a call to action in terms of some of the next steps that you can take. So let's get right to equity, inclusion, and diversity. And this is just to level set us all on what we're going to be focusing on for the next hour or so. So there was a study that was done at Cornell many years ago that talked about what is exactly diversity and inclusion. And so this is just a basic definition that the study came up with. And so what I'd like to do is challenge each of you after this session to consider doing a communications audit where you review all of your existing tactics and potentially refresh them over the next 6 to 9 months. There's many dimensions of diversity, and there's everything from what's obvious in terms of race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, but these are just some of the beginning stages of what organizations are looking at when they look at diversity and inclusion. And when we think about inclusive work cultures, many organizations have shifted their focus away from the diversity aspect and more to creating a sense of belonging and creating an inclusive environment. There's things now that you need to think about, like neurodiversity and employing those on the autism spectrum and seeing how they can be active and productive members of your workforce. Just today, PRSA, in their daily issues and trends, shared an article from Fast Company that working from home is great for diversity and all the benefits that women are seeing, disabled employees, and even the opportunities that it's opening up for different races. So we all want to belong to something bigger than ourselves. So we talked about what diversity and inclusion is, but why? I think there's a lot of research out there that's been done over the last 10 years, and we have a lot more data about our workforce and what's important. And so there's a lot of business case articles that are out there that point to when you have a more diverse and inclusive employee base, board of directors, you're going to generate more cash flow, more revenue, and you're more likely to meet your financial targets. And so profitability and innovation has now been studied in corporations and organizations that embrace diversity. It also impacts innovation. And so Deloitte recently came out with a study that talks about the impact that diversity has on innovation and achieving your business outcomes, reducing your risk, and exceeding your financial targets. And I think that COVID-19 is a great example of challenging us to be more innovative and to think outside the box. Just today on the Today Show, the chairman of the board of Ford talked about manufacturing partnerships that they've formed with 3M, General Motors, to produce face masks, shields, and ventilators in this crisis. So innovation is definitely something that is going to be front and center as we move through this. A lot of organizations in the beginning, when they start on their diversity and inclusion journey, they appoint a leader to basically lead the effort. And in my research, it says that only 20% of the Fortune 500 actually have a D&I corporate executive. And then companies go about setting goals. And I encourage you that as you do this, you make those goals visible. Your diversity and inclusion should integrate with your company business goals. A lot of companies now are doing more training on topics like unconscious bias. And really think about your employer brand messaging and collateral when you're developing recruiting materials to attract talent and to develop people in your organizations. And then it's our job to really communicate the importance of this internally and externally. A lot of companies form employee resource groups or community outreach groups. And there's a lot of opportunities that are hidden in supply chain and customer opportunities. But I was really gratified to see that chief diversity officers really value their partnership with marketing and communications professionals as we sort of work through what this is going to mean for different organizations. Amy just wants to know, how can you do a communications audit? So I recommend that you look at all of your marketing and communications collateral, starting with your employee recruiting material, your website where people can apply for jobs, all of the tactics that are out there that are your brand to your employees. Look at your internal, so you can do an internal and an external audit. You've got existing tactics, and just kind of list them out and review them, and look at the messaging, look at the visuals that you have associated with them. So again, there was a recent report from McKinsey & Company that companies in the top 25% on gender and racial diversity are more likely to overperform in relationship to their industry peers. So if you lack diversity in your staff, one way that you could look at this is the profile of your customers. If your customers are diverse or exhibit different dimensions of diversity, how can your communications reflect that diversity and the way they want to receive information? So what's happened is US companies specifically have gone out and just spent billions and billions of dollars on diversity training. But one of the things that the research is showing is that this is just an ineffective approach. You can't do once and done training. And so this is where I think we come in to the equation with our organizations, and that we really should be having a very detailed multi-channel communication strategy just focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion, or at least a section within our overall communication strategy to support this, embedding this into the organization. So before I go on to any trends, I don't know if anyone has any thoughts, any insights, or any comments. I am going to be sharing some actionable tips later in my presentation around messaging, around some of the specific tactics that you can look at, as well as some best practices that some organizations are doing that you can implement. But I just want to take a pause and make sure that we're all grounded in what we're talking about in terms of content, in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I'll talk a lot in the trends about specific areas where you can really get tactical and you can really dig your heels in and work with your HR business partners on some of this activity.
Tracy, there was one question in the chat that might be suitable for right now, and it's, would you recommend that companies right now mention themes related to equity, diversity, and inclusion in their employee communication when they're reminding employees to be careful about cyber threats and all the other things that we need to be careful of right now during the COVID-19 crisis? I
would say yes. What I'm seeing when I'm watching the news is the companies that have embraced all the dimensions of diversity of their workforce are the ones that are stepping up and becoming more innovative, are the ones that are responding, are the ones that and I would say even like profiling some of your employees on the front lines that are responding on behalf of your organization is really good PR and messaging, as well as any kind of internal inclusivity. I would say even if you have these employee resource groups, reaching out to the leaders within them to get feedback on the communications that you're sending out, what's landing, what's not landing, what types of things across time zones, if you're a global company, is happening. While it is a global thing, different things are happening at a different pace, whether you're in Spain or Italy or the US. And so I would say absolutely that this should be something that's front of mind as you're developing your COVID-19 communications.
Thanks, Tracy. That's all the questions we have at the moment. We will be pausing again after a number of additional points from Tracy. So feel free to enter your questions in the chat and we'll save them up for her next pause. Thanks, everyone.
Great. So let's move on to the trends, because I think this is really where you guys need to be up on what's kind of going on. And these are things that you need to have on your radar. Maybe not so much while we're in the pandemic, maybe as we come out of it, but you could do some planning and some research now if you're aware of sort of some of the trends. And so one of the things is this is going to be moving beyond just a poster on the wall. This is going to be really a business model that the most successful organizations are going to embrace as we see some of the demographics changing in the workforce. So just know that this is not going away. This is going to get deeper into the organizations as we come out of this. The other thing that I've started to see and is this male allies program. So there's, especially after the Me Too movement, white males were not really sure where to go with this, what was appropriate, what was not. And so many organizations started to create male ally programs. So that's something that you can look into as well. The other thing that I'm going to talk about this a little bit later is that candidates with criminal records are going to start to demand fair and equal attention. And I'll go through some resources that I found through the Society for HR Management that will help jumpstart your ability to kind of learn more about that. The other thing is there's going to be this whole refresh of content, and we're part of this. I think HR is going to redo job descriptions, our employee communications, and all of our HR content. We really need to be more sensitive, and I'm going to provide you guys with some examples of some companies that are doing this well and some resources that can help guide you so you're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. And then the other thing is all of your recruiting tools that your organization is using to hire people are really diversity of recruitment tools. If people don't see someone that looks and feels like them, then they're going to not think that this is an organization where they are welcome. And they're going to move along and they're going to find an organization where they see themselves in the organization. So those are a couple things. The other trends that I think you need to pay attention to is the terminology in the D&I world is shifting to equity, diversity, and inclusion, or equity, inclusion, and diversity. So they're adding that element, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is and what you need to do. Companies for the last 5 or 6 years have been focused on multi-generational workforce. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and give you some ideas in that space. The other thing that has really come out is the impact of unconscious bias and microaggressions that are happening in the workplace. And so a lot of companies have gone out and brought unconscious bias training to the workplace. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. The other thing that's happened is organizations are finding they need to support gender identity and expression, and I'm going to give you some resources around that. And then what I'm not going to cover is diversity of political thought and election cycle. But these are sort of the just, things that you need to be paying attention to as you're thinking about how you communicate this. So let's talk about why equity is now part of that equation. So what organizations are realizing is they're recognizing that this is just another layer of a dimension of diversity that needs to be addressed. There's also a lot more research out there that continues to show inequality around hiring, pay, and promotions, as well as developmental opportunities. And so companies are starting to take on strategic and tactical initiatives to address these issues. So my challenge to you is, can you start to think about what your organization is doing around these equity issues? And I'm going to cover what some of them are and give you some resources to get started in the equity space and how you add that into your communications. Okay, so let's talk about multi-generational workforce. So one thing that we need to know is I think it's really important that we get with our HR teams to get the demographics on our specific organization. There's even a generation before traditionalists and a generation after Gen Z. So you've got the silent generation, which is ahead of traditionalists. That's, my 86-year-old mother-in-law, but she might be your customer. And so she needs to be in the mix of when you're thinking about this. And then after Gen Z is the alpha generation that is coming up through this situation. But I think that the most important thing is to really look at what is your company doing around not just age, but disability, race, gender, veteran status, all of those things. And as we have a lot of different generations in the workforce, and as companies are moving more towards remote work, and as people are demanding certain things from their employers, I think it's important that we think about how we present content to our customers, as well as our suppliers, as well as our employees. So can you think about maybe in your communications audit, tweaking some of your tactics and tweaking some of your messaging? So let's talk about the other hot topic, unconscious bias. So unconscious bias is really, it creates a barrier on so many levels, and we all have it. And this really came of interest, I would say, in 2018. Some of you may have gone through training, but I think it's just important to know that this is a topic that you can support your HR team and your executive team in terms of bringing to your organization. And so there's a lot of different sources of our bias. It comes from our experiences, it comes from the information we consume, it comes from our education, the context of where we live, our family, our friends, our particular culture, and even some traits that we're born with. So I encourage you to put this on your checklist of things to do after this webinar, is to explore what are you doing in the area of unconscious bias. The next thing is gender expression. And so this has been around for a while. Some of the things that, so gender identity is how the person sees themselves. It's different than sexual orientation, and gender expression is how the person outwardly shows their gender identity. And I put some resources here that I found in my research, but I think that one of your takeaways could be to get with your HR partners on policies, procedures, communications that address these types of issues in your organizations. I know some organizations in their health benefits provides benefits for transitioning genders. I know that some organizations have adapted their bathroom facilities. I know that some organizations have introduced the pronouns that you prefer, like mine would be she/her. And so these are some things that I think that you can put on your list as you audit. What are you doing to be sensitive around gender identity and gender expression? So another topic that's kind of being profiled in the news a lot is pay equity. So the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, is who really regulates that. We have a lot of laws in place. Unfortunately, what the facts are is that in the US, women on average earn only 80 cents on the dollar earned by men. African-American women earn 63 cents per dollar, and it's even worse for Hispanic women. And so I just want to point this out, that this may be a topic that your CEO and your chief HR officer is, they're kind of grappling with. Sometimes what happens is if your organization has had to settle a very high profile EEOC case, how do you deal with that? How do you communicate that back into the organization? So next up is the criminal records, which is like another aspect of something that you need to be aware of. So SHRM partnered with the Coke Industries when the First Step Act became a law. And this is really a movement to get those with criminal histories a fair chance at employment. So at any point in time, 2.3 million Americans are incarcerated. And 1/3 of American adults, which is about 75 million people, have a criminal record. And as you can imagine, they have difficulty finding employment. But each year, over 650,000 people are being released. And so the single most important predictor of what they call recidivism is joblessness. So they go back into their criminal patterns or whatever, and then they land back. So it out there that I thought was really good about getting talent back to work, that you could potentially explore if this is something that in your organization is something that is happening now or could potentially happen moving forward. The next 3 slides, I just put together some best practices where I was just trying to research as much as I could companies that are really doing this right, companies that are really putting things out there that like the Hubble Space Telescope is now, you know, there's a lot of gender bias in job applications, and so they've really gone in and made it so that the hiring manager doesn't know what gender you are when you apply for a job. Salesforce just appointed their first chief equity officer. Hilton has put in place a flexible, very region-specific program. But at the end of the day, if you go back to what we learned in sociology of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, these are the things that we need to just keep front and center. These are some more resources that I thought would be helpful, whether you're dealing with female issues, LGBTQ, Latino, NAACP. These are all some websites that have diversity and inclusion content that you can pull from that will help you. And here's some books for those of you who are readers. There's a lot of different books on the marketplace that are out there that can provide you different insights, different perspectives on all of these topics. And so there's a lot of companies out there that are doing this right. The ones that seem to be the most focused on it, maybe have been at it the longest, typically do have a chief diversity officer that reports to the CEO. They have a strategy in place that deals with the supplier pillar, the marketing, customer marketing pillar, the employee pillar, and really have put some dollars and cents towards actually supporting those activities, doing the unconscious bias training, forming those employee resource groups. And there's a lot of resources online that can teach you how to set up an employee resource group. And I'm happy to talk to anybody after this webinar, having set them up and where to kind of go to get those resources. So at this point, I'm going to take another pause to just see if anybody has any questions about those big flick trends, what's out there, and where to go to get more information. And then Amy, if there's any questions that have come in.
Yes, Tracy. So actually, something you just mentioned, this came in a little while ago, right after our last pause. One of our attendees asked, and there's kind of three questions here, you can work this together. Mm-hmm. Can you share an example of how employee resource groups might be structured? How does industry impact the aspects of D&I that are addressed? For instance, in an industry that's male-dominated like tech, would you foresee a male allies employee resource group?
Those are great questions. So yes. Okay, so an employee resource group typically is open to anyone. You don't have to have that dimension of diversity to belong. So for example, you could be in, I'm just going to make this up, the ones that I've been in the past, women in aerospace and women in aerospace and defense. And so you don't have to be a woman to belong, but the purpose of the group, and usually these employee resource groups are chartered with a specific purpose and a specific mission and specific business outcomes, and facilitated by a professional diversity and inclusion trainer. So it varies by industry, and it can be any dimension of diversity that forms a group. And it's to make sure their voice is heard in the organization and their perspectives are considered. And so it does vary from industry to industry. I've worked in a lot of different sectors. However, there's some common ways that you can go about setting these up. And there are actually male ally groups, specifically in like Silicon Valley. We have several here in Baltimore that have partnered with executive women's groups that I'm a part of. And so it's already happening, and it will continue to trend in that direction. And so those are all really good questions. I'm happy to talk to anybody about sort of what my experience has been in setting them up, how they get run. How you measure the effectiveness. It can't just be like a party in the conference room with, you know, ethnic dishes. It needs to go deeper than that in terms of the conversations and addressing the true needs of that particular employee resource group.
Thank you, very helpful. And actually, one person asked, have you seen best practices in action among companies you work with? I'm realizing you can't go into a lot of detail on your clients, but can you give any examples, perhaps without naming names, of strong practices?
Sure. I'm going to cover some of them a little bit later in the presentation. But yes, like I said, having that person that's really leading the charge at the top of the organization, working in concert with the CEO and the overall business strategy objectives that the company is looking for, tend to have the best practices. You can even read online. There's a diversity and inclusion magazine that chief diversity and inclusion officers write articles. So there's a lot of resources out there in terms of what companies are doing, what they've done in the past as they move on the spectrum, because it is kind of a spectrum of your adoption and integration of a lot of these things. Some companies, so somebody asked a question about the informal groups. What tends to work the best is the corporately sponsored groups, because you're going to get funding. You're going to get the backing from senior management. I mean, not that you can't have informal groups, but I just have seen that organizations that really put some muscle behind what they're trying to do tends to work well. The other thing I've seen when I worked for the national company, we set a framework and then we pushed it out to the field. And as long as the field implemented the framework, they could be creative about the implementation and the execution. So it's more about creating that overall construct and structure, and then letting people do their thing at the local level, because it's really important that people have ownership in the execution of how it's being implemented, and it's in the spirit of what the framework is. So that's one thing that I've seen work really, really well.
The only other question pending at the moment, if we have thought of ourselves as unbiased and we've attended unconscious bias training in the past, is it worthwhile for us to revisit that periodically?
I would say yes. We all have unconscious bias and we don't even realize it. It's in our subconscious. And so I do believe that we have an obligation as communicators and culture makers to have that awareness around what our unconscious bias is. And I think that it's a lifelong journey to make sure that we're not contributing to the problem unconsciously. And so I would say dust off that training that you went through, Google some articles, watch some videos. There's a lot of, I think there's even some training material on LinkedIn Learning that you can, I think you have to pay for it, but it's not that terribly expensive. So I would say yes.
Thank you. Well, that's it for now. We'll be pausing again for questions in just a few more slides if anyone has more questions to enter into the chat. Go ahead, Tracy.
Okay, so this last section is really connecting what we just talked about, you know, making sure we're all on the same page around diversity, inclusion, and equity, and really thinking about what are we going to do and what responsibility do we have in our roles within the organization. And so this is really about organizational transformation and change at its core. And we really, in addition to our writing and project management responsibilities, we really have an obligation to contribute to the conversation. And so each of us has our own dimensions of diversity that we can bring perspective to these discussions. And I also kind of challenge you to think about ways to talk more about the human condition as opposed to being divisive and the differences among employees, kind of going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so really what I want to challenge you is to think about your role in this context, that you're a culture change maker. And so what does that really mean? So we have this obligation and we are the stewards of the reputation, and we're partnering with our senior team and our HR partners on this journey. And so I really want us to think more consciously about how we're using our influence, how we're personally communicating, and then how we're crafting these communications. And I want us to think through the lens of equity, inclusion, and diversity. So before you hit the send button, before you post something to the website, before you draft that press release or you pitch, think about all those things. Just take that pause to think through what the implications are, and how this is going to land with your audience. I think that it's really important that we're strategic, and where we can really make a difference is if we hone our tactics. And really think about what are the business outcomes that the C-suite's looking for, right? And then you can create an effective communications campaign to support that culture change. So change is going to happen over a long period of time. You can't just write something, send it out, and then the culture changes. And so it's really digging deep into understanding what's going on in the culture, really digging deep into what some of those solutions are going to be, and understanding what that long-term vision is for your organization in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so some of the things I think we really need to be sensitive about is the images that we're using, the language and the messaging, the stories that we're telling. I think we need to be sensitive to all kinds of dimensions of diversity, whether it's you're dealing with someone in the Asia Pacific region or you're dealing with somebody down the hall. And then think about maybe creating an inclusive language toolkit. And I'm going to share a link with you where you can go and see how other organizations have done this. So it's really kind of like putting our antennas up around diversity and inclusion, and wrapping our communications in this. So some of this is really tactical. But I do think that you need a detailed strategy with messaging and metrics if you don't already have that. And what I like to say is that look at the employee life cycle. This is sort of an HR view of the world. So you recruit people to the company, you pick them, you select them, you evaluate their performance, you figure out who's going to succeed who, you develop people, and then people transition out, whether they leave the organization or they retire. Along this life cycle, there are touch points all the way. And along the way, there are communications tactics throughout the employee life cycle. And so it's really important that you use sort of the PESO model of paid, earned, owned, and social, and how you're going to do this. But your images and your storytelling needs to be really authentic. You want to be giving voice to these individual employees and giving voice to these employee resource groups. And so Handshake, which is a website it's almost like a career management website, they have put together an inclusive language principles, and that's a good place to start to pull all this together. The other thing I thought was really interesting when I was putting this together is if you look at IBC's global standards, we have 6 of them. And within those 6 standards, so this is sort of the standards that we hold ourselves to, is ethics, and that's all about communicating with sensitivity to culture, values, and beliefs. Consistency is that you're recognizing your diverse stakeholders. Context is you're understanding the culture. Analysis, we're out there researching and evaluating. Strategy, we're understanding what the communications challenges are, and then the engagement piece, which is fostering and nourishing those relationships. So I just put this out there because I thought it was really interesting that IBC, and I think because it is a global organization, we've got this different lens that we look at. And so at this point, what I'd like to say is I'm hoping that you can take this information, improve your comm strategy, and embed some of these diversity, inclusion, and equity concepts into that. So it may be you need new tactics. It may be that you need to change your messaging or your visuals. It may be that you need to actually create this HR communications plan that's in more detail. And so I just want to challenge you to take this information, albeit high level and very brief, to really come up with what can you do, within your organization in this aspect of becoming that culture maker and really being part of the cultural transformation. So I'm going to turn it back over shortly. We did had these questions at the beginning, which was how can we ensure our organizations include those diverse perspectives? I think it's being very intentional, and hopefully after this webinar, you will become more intentional. And then I think there are ways that you can highlight the dimensions of diversity and the culture as you do PR, as you do your recruiting and branding. And then I think that really looking at the demographics of your current workforce and where change, and after this global pandemic, who knows where we're going to be, right? But what types of people does your organization need to attract and retain, and what kind of messages are they going to really resonate with and want to come and work for your organization? And so I think that one of the things that you're also going to want to think about is if you have a key performance indicators and metrics that have been established by your CEO and your chief diversity officer, that's where you start. What needle are you trying to move for the business? Is it you want to recruit more of a certain dimension of people into the workforce? Is it that you want to expand into a new marketplace or a new country? What are those metrics that the business is trying to look at in terms of profitability, innovation? Maybe it's inventing new products and services. Whatever those balanced scorecard goals are, you should make sure that you have a communication strategy around that is then going to be the metric. So it's not necessarily that everyone got your newsletter. It's what did people do with it? What was the call to action? Did you get more sales? Did you increase operating profit margins? Did you hire more of a certain dimension of diversity? And so those are the things I think you need to look at when you're putting all this together.
Okay, Tracy, just going back into the chat, it looks like you just answered the question that came in about talking about metrics and KPIs to demonstrate the impact of communication on the diversity agenda. If that person has additional questions along those lines, please feel free to enter some more questions. We also received a question about how can we work with other parts of our organization, perhaps overcoming obstacles in adjusting our messaging and our metrics as part of our ED&I metric strategy.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You know, we are very much in our roles in support of the greater organization. And I think that having the conversation with the C-suite and the head of HR, which is normally where this type of work lies. But then there's also your customer marketing partners, if you're not the person doing the marketing too, as well as your leaders in supply chain. And so I think it's really being intentional about sitting down and saying, and making some recommendations, right? So saying, especially after you do your communications audit. So you can say, you know, I went to this webinar, made all these suggestions, I did an audit, here's what came up for me, here's kind of the path forward where I think we can close some of these gaps in our marketing and communications efforts, getting their buy-in, getting their perspective, you know, and then you just prioritize, you know, how you're going to implement those. So you can't bite off the whole elephant, but you could have some low-hanging fruit. It may be as simple as redesigning the landing page for your careers portal. It may be changing some of the images so that they are actually reflective of your workforce. And you know, maybe not using stock images, but using pictures of real employees that show all their dimensions of diversity. It could be as simple as on your intranet, you know, making sure that these employee resource groups have a place for their content to live, and support for their events. A lot of times events are a big thing for employees resource groups. So I think that figuring out who your strategic partners are within the organization and starting at the highest level is going to be your best bet to really get there. And I agree, people are saying we're all in this together, which we are, and people are feeling that. And I think we as communicators should go dig a little deeper and really start to give some essence to that, some real storytelling, some real, that's such a broad state. But what are the steps that we're taking to make people feel like they belong? What are we doing to make people feel like things are equitable? Those are the types of conversations I think we should be having with our colleagues.
Thanks, Tracy. We don't have Oh, looks like we got one more just now. All right. What are your suggestions on how to professionally tell the story of your D&I goals and future successes externally? Is that what you were just talking about, the storytelling? So
Yeah, storytelling. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to find the stories. I think that they're happening every single day, and I think that it could be. I mean, when I worked in senior housing, you know, it could be as simple as the nurses, the CNAs or the GNAs, like that were bedside with our residents, spoke Spanish, and the resident didn't speak English. It could be even as simple as that was part of our caring and compassion, was that we had resources that could speak their language, right? So it's finding those stories in your industry, in your sector. If you're in a nonprofit, it could be the people that your nonprofit serves. It could be your donors, right? And so really thinking about all your stakeholders and then finding those stories and telling them, using video to tell them, putting them on social media. A lot of companies have done, I know Lockheed Martin is one that has done a really nice job highlighting veterans that have left the military that they've hired and how they've transitioned. So there's a lot of different ways depending on, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about your specifics and just brainstorm ideas with you. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Heather.
Thank you so much, Tracy. This has been such a wonderful presentation, and we truly appreciate your time today. But it looks like it's time for us to wrap up. If you'll go to the next slide on our next steps. Everyone, before we fully wrap up, we want to back one slide, Tracy, so my apologies. Before we wrap up, want to make sure that you're aware of some quick notes. If you have any additional questions, you can contact Tracy via email, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Her contact information is there on the slide. We would also truly appreciate you to complete the survey, which will open when you exit. Additionally, our next webinar takes place Tuesday, April 14th at 1 p.m. Anthony Estrico, an award-winning director, filmmaker, and communication professional, will share inspiring ways to effectively connect with customers and drive action via video. And finally, if you have questions about the webinar, the DC Metro chapter, or the IABC Heritage Region, or would like to get more involved, please contact the emails listed on the slide currently. Next slide. Additionally, some resources and opportunities for you. Right now, the IABC Heritage Region is offering 2 keynote and 2 breakout session recordings from the region's 2019 Communication Conference at an extra affordable price of $40 for all 4. To get a taste of last year's conference and reserve your download, go to bit.ly/4for40. Additionally, don't miss out on this year's regional conference, November 8th through 10th in Boston. For details, go to the URL on your webpage. Also, March is a special month. It's IABC Membership Month. To learn more about membership benefits, go to iabc.com/membership. Finally, the DC Metro chapter is partnering with the 2020 Mid-Atlantic Marketing Summit. Visit our website for more information on the program and on other additional online events. The URL is on your screen. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.